But before we go deeper into that, I want to consider the first thing. While Jesus was in Bethany, this is verse 6 of Matthew 26, while Jesus was in Bethany in the home of Simon the Leper, a woman came to him. Now you read John 12, and let's do that now. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany where Lazarus lived, whom he had raised from the dead. Here a dinner was given in Jesus' honour, and Martha served, his sister, in the kitchen, while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with him. Then Mary, the other sister, took the pint of pure nard and anointed Jesus. Now, I always read and always thought to myself, this has to be at Lazarus' house. And Martha, she's serving in her own kitchen. And the reason we go down this path is because we have the story in Luke, if you remember, where Jesus visited Mary and Martha. And Martha was doing all the serving and doing all the preparations. And Mary was just sitting at Jesus' feet, listening to what he had to say. And so Martha got annoyed and said to Jesus, "Tell her to come and help me." And Jesus said, "No, Martha's chosen the better way here. And it's not going to be taken away from her." Because we have that story in Luke, we automatically think here, oh, well, this is just at Lazarus' house. But yet the Matthew and the Mark says it's this anointing happened at the home of Simon the Leper. But if we look at John here and we look closely at what he actually says, he says 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, okay, where Lazarus lived. So that's where Lazarus lived. He lived in that town. Okay, did it say house? No, it's where he lived, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. Yes, in John 11 he did that, just previous chapter. Here a dinner was given in Jesus' honour. Martha served while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with him. Here a dinner was set. Where? Here. The here in context is Bethany. In Bethany a dinner was given, and Martha served, and Jesus was among those reclining at the table. And what we have to consider is the first time Jesus visited Mary and Martha in Luke, it was just him and his disciples. So it was only 13 people. And they could fit in that house. But clearly now, Jesus' fame has gone skyrocketing because he's just raised Lazarus out of the tomb and everyone's talking about it. And now there's an honorary dinner for Jesus, probably because of what he'd done for Lazarus. And Lazarus was the VIP guest. And there would have been a massive crowd at this event. And so they needed a bigger venue. And obviously this Simon the Leper, his house can fit everyone in. And so in John, it never actually says that it was at their house, but we presume that. We just naturally presume it must have been at their house because it seems contextually sound, but that's not actually what it says. It just says somewhere in Bethany, and that was the town where Lazarus lived. There was a dinner in honour of Jesus. And so Mary took about the pint of nard, that's the same, an expensive perfume. She poured it on Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. So here we have Mary, and she is pouring the perfume on Jesus' feet and wiping it with her hair. So this is similar to what the sinful woman did in Luke chapter 7. But when you look in Matthew 26, and we go to verse 6, while Jesus was in Bethany, that's the same, it's in the home of Simon the Leper, not in Lazarus' home, in the home of Simon the Leper, a woman came to him with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume. Some woman. Okay, John specifically says this is Mary. If you think about Matthew and Mark, they never mention Mary and Martha. Only Luke and John mention them. So they're not going to say Mary. Neither is Mark. It's not going to say Mary. We don't even know these people in that gospel. They're not mentioned. So it's just a woman. But we know it's Mary from John. She came to him with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume. Same. And Mark actually says that is expensive pure nard or spikenard. Matthew omits that point. And she poured it on his head as he was reclining at the table. So Matthew and Mark say she poured it on his head. John says she poured it on his feet and wiped them clean with her hair. And what we've got to consider here is it's just two different details of the same story. Because Jesus said, she has done this to anoint me for burial. We know that a burial anointing is going to be from the head to the toe, most likely I would presume, or at the very least, the head and the feet. So to complete the full thing, she's poured it over his head and she's got some left, and some's dripped down and she's also got some left, and so she's put it on his feet and wiped it with her hair. So let's now cross over to Mark instead of Matthew, because now Mark has greater detail than Matthew in the second half of this story. So we'll start in verse 4 of chapter 14. Some of those present were saying indignantly to one another, "Why this waste of perfume? It could have been sold for more than a year's wages and the money given to the poor." And they rebuked her harshly. So they were talking amongst themselves in Mark and Matthew, and they were saying these things to themselves. But then if we look in John, we realise that Judas had the audacity to actually verbalise it in front of everyone and to actually tell Jesus this whole thing. In John chapter 12 verse 4, it says, "But one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, objected. 'Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages.'" So we see here that Judas has said pretty much the same things that everyone else was saying. It should have been sold and given to the poor, and it was worth a year's wages. He says a year's wages. The people were saying more than a year's wages. There's an extra Greek word there, 𝐴𝑝ano. So maybe Judas said more than a year's wages and John just left that little detail out. We're not sure. Or maybe he just said exactly worth a year's wages. We could have sold it for a year's wages. 300 denarii, 300 working days, which is approximately 1 year's annual wage. And then verse 6 goes on to give us a bit more detail. "Judas did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. As the keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it." So we see that Judas has a greed problem. And so that's going to play into the solution, that meeting that happened with the chief priests and the scribes and the elders of the people 2 days before the Passover. 4 days later, we could say 3 technically, but let's just say 4. 4 days later, there was going to be this meeting and they needed a solution. How are we going to betray Jesus? Quietly, do it secretly. And you've got this guy Judas who's got a greed problem, but now on top of the greed problem, he's going to get offended because Jesus is going to rebuke him. And this is where the rebuke is directly to Judas in John, and in Matthew and Mark it's to everyone in the house, because pretty much everyone had the same opinion as Judas. And this is what he says in verse 7. "Leave her alone," Jesus replied. "It was intended that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial. You will always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me." And I think Mark says, "You'll always have the poor among you and you can help them anytime you want, but you'll not always have me." So now Judas, he's offended at Jesus and he's got a greed problem. And these two factors are going to culminate together as a solution that's going to enable the religious leaders to betray Jesus and crucify him on the Good Friday coming up. But it's interesting how it ended up being Good Friday, because they said they didn't want to do it during the feast, and in the end they ended up doing it exactly smack bang on the feast, because that was prophetically, it had to line up with the Passover lamb being slain and everything like that at the temple. And the added detail in Matthew and Mark is that Jesus concluded the rebuke by saying, "I tell you the truth, wherever this gospel is preached throughout the world, what this woman has done to me will be told in memory of her." And we're still telling it to this day, and it's actually, we know it's actually Mary, the sister of Lazarus and Martha. So why do Matthew and Mark decide to put this story completely out of chronological order? Well, the reason is the relevance to the story is now. And if they'd put it back when it actually happened chronologically, it'd be so many chapters earlier that we wouldn't even remember probably what it was about, because they have so much content in between these 4 days or these 3 days. They have Jesus being tested for defects by the religious leaders. The Passover lamb being tested for defects, where they tested him in the temple, all these different questions. The Sadducees had to go, the Herodians had to go, the Pharisees had to go, the scribes had to go, and they kept testing him. They have all that. John doesn't include any of that. Then there's those 7 woes I was talking about, where Jesus was rebuking. "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites." So he's having a go at the Pharisees and their leadership, which is the scribes. That's not in John either, and it's in Matthew. And then after that, that's Matthew 23. Then Matthew 24, you have the Olivet Discourse of the end times predictions, and Matthew 25, you have those end times stories as well. 2 parables, and then you have the story of the sheep and the goats. And all that content is in between these 4 days. Whereas John doesn't include any of that. And nor does he even include the part where Judas goes off to the chief priest to betray Jesus for 30 silver coins. So he doesn't need to put this anointing of when Mary anointed Jesus at this point in the gospel like Matthew and Mark do, because it's not relevant. He's just going to put it in exact chronological order. And if you've listened to many of my previous videos on the gospel synchronization, you'll know that I've stated that the Gospel of John is the only gospel that's completely chronological. The others 3 synoptics are not in many spots. And so that's the end of John with regard to this sort of story. It goes on to talk about how the chief priest started to decide to kill Lazarus as well, because everyone was flocking to Jesus because of the miracle that he'd done in raising him from the dead. But if we go back to Matthew, which for the third and final part actually has more details than Mark again, from verse 14 we see this. Then one of the 12, the one called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and asked, "What are you willing to give me if I deliver him over to you?" So they counted out for him 30 pieces of silver. From then on, Judas watched for an opportunity to hand him over. So we see here that it is Judas Iscariot that goes off to the chief priests. And now we're back 2 days before the Passover. We're back live, to say. We're on live TV here. We're not reminiscing over the past. So that word then is bringing us back to the current narrative, to the now. So Matthew's telling us, then, after this meeting, Judas went, and they offered him 30 pieces of silver. So we've been told in John that he was the one that was offended. We've been given that detail there. Specifically, he was the one that spoke up. And we've been told that he loved the money bag, and that's why he wanted it to be sold and the money put in the money bag. He wasn't going to give it to the poor. So he wanted the money, and then he was offended. And so for 4 days, Judas is stewing over this offence. And he's annoyed at Jesus, and it's building, and it's overwhelming him, and his greed for money, all these things are overwhelming him. And he's like, I'm just going to go to the chief priests and ask if they want me to hand him over. I've heard some whispers that they want to kill Jesus. Maybe I can help. And then he's the solution to their problem. He's the solution to their dilemma that they didn't know what to do. He comes to them. Oh, how easy is that? Now it's solved. And that's why Matthew and Mark put the anointing of Mary with the expensive perfume, Mary anointing Jesus with the expensive perfume. That's why they put it in between this sandwich, in the middle of this story. And then we pick up back live again. They reminisce for that story, and then they get back to the current situation of what's going on. And when we inject John into the equation, we can understand why Judas went off. Because this story was actually specifically about him. And from there, Luke 22 verse 6 actually has the most detail, where it says that Judas consented, and from then on, he looked for an opportunity to hand Jesus over to them while no crowd was present. That last bit's only in Luke. And we know that ended up being the opportunity in the Garden of Gethsemane under the cover of night.